So we begin today with a reading from Genesis chapter 45. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry up and go to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty.' And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him." The word of the Lord.
So, you know, Joseph, he really is a surprising kind of guy. And perhaps that's why his story from antiquity is remembered at the end of Genesis. This is the end of the beginning of the story, and a whole bunch of it is devoted to the story of Joseph. You may remember that Joseph, one of the youngest of the sons of Jacob, was sold into slavery by his brothers. Then they took his coat of many colors, dipped it in animal blood, and told their father that Joseph had been eaten by wild animals. Meanwhile, Joseph found himself sold into slavery in Egypt, where he nearly died in prison. But after being able to interpret Pharaoh's dream about years of plenty and years of famine, he suddenly became a high officer in Pharaoh's court in charge of who got food and who did not. Joseph's interpretation of the dream, you may also remember, was that after 7 great years of good crops, there would be 7 years of desperate famine. And so it is that by the 2nd year of this famine, Joseph's brothers come down to Egypt to buy food, because the famine is bad back in the land of Canaan as well. Joseph immediately recognizes his brothers, but they don't recognize him. And at that point in the story, that is the time that everybody should expect paybacks. Now I'm going to get you good. Ha, 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 kneel and grovel at me. Now is the time when Joseph could really get revenge for what his brothers had put him through. He could, as I was telling the kids, order them all arrested, tortured, killed. He could make them all his slaves. Or he could simply laugh at them and send them away with nothing, letting them starve. Now, Joseph, we missed all of the story here. Joseph does mess with them a little bit. He sends them back with some grain before this happens, and secretly returns their money, making them think that they will be in trouble for not paying. Then on the 2nd trip, he has his steward hide his silver cup in the bag of his youngest brother, and then go after them and accuse them of stealing the cup. So they're all brought back, and they're scared, and this is the moment when today's reading begins. And you should really expect then is now the time for the paybacks to happen, but it doesn't. Joseph tells his brothers who he is, and he offers them all refuge, and he promises to provide for them and for their families. Many of us have heard this story before, because with Joseph and the coat of many colors, it's been made into a play. We teach it in our Bible studies, in our Bible stories to little kids. And so it doesn't surprise us anymore, but it should. Paybacks are usually the way stories like this end. There's always some kind of comeuppance for people like Joseph's brothers, who really are nasty people who do not repent at all. And remember, this story is set hundreds of years before the Torah is given, which says that vengeance belongs to God. So Joseph has no religious reason to forgive his brothers. There is no commandment from God that he has ever heard that says, vengeance is mine, you can't take vengeance. Sure, Joseph can, but he doesn't. Joseph is a surprise. And that's perhaps what made this story memorable. In today's gospel reading, Jesus contrasts the way he calls his disciples to live from the ways that everyone expects. If you do good to those who do good to you, what difference does anybody see in you? You're not a surprise. But if you bless those who curse you and pray for those who persecute you, people will notice. You're the kind of surprise that makes God's light get noticed. And that's what Joseph did. But it cannot have been easy. What is it that could possibly have made Joseph decide to be a surprise? Doing what Joseph did was absolutely counterintuitive. But perhaps Joseph was able to be a surprise because he recognized how God had helped him in spite of the evil that he had experienced. See, Joseph never thinks that getting sold into slavery was a good thing. He never says, this was great that you did this to me, or that God had intended it. God planned for you to sell me into slavery. He tells his brothers that God sent him to Egypt. That is, God brought him to a place where he could prosper in spite of the evil acts of his brother. And later, after the death of their father, later on in the story, the brothers are still worried that they're in for paybacks. Joseph tells them bluntly, you boneheads, that's not exactly what he calls them, but basically, you boneheads meant this for evil, but God brought good out of it anyway. God could take something that was absolutely evil and intended by you to be evil and transform it. So Joseph sees God's action even through the evil that's going on in the world around him. And often, it's the ability to recognize and experience God's presence and help in the midst of evil and pain that makes it possible to be a surprise. So I always tell people, don't ever be one of those well-meaning people who says to somebody who's going through a terrible time, oh, maybe this terrible thing is a way that God is preparing you for something better later on. Never say this to others. First, because it's almost surely wrong. Joseph never thinks God intended or planned this evil thing. And second, because it's never helpful. But it can be the case in your own life, and I know this has happened in mine, that sometimes because of a horrible situation that I have endured, I have the ability to empathize with or help somebody else who's going through a similar situation. God did not give me that bad situation to prepare me, but God can use that bad situation to give me an opportunity to do good in the life of somebody else. And that's what Joseph figures out here. And sometimes we can see that in our own lives, and that's what makes being a surprise possible. Maybe the thing also with Joseph is that Joseph, of all these characters, remains focused on the future instead of dwelling on the past. That's often hard to do also. We nurture old wounds, we dwell on what could have been, and we mourn what we've lost. Surely Joseph must have had some of that going on as well, but when he reveals himself to his brothers, his very first words were, is my father still alive? He looks to the future. He looks at them and says, I get to see my dad again. There's possibility and there's promise ahead, which people often miss when they get focused on the past. And the ability to do that is often a surprising thing in the world around us. Because it's sometimes the case for us too. I mean, I know that often for me, it's hard to envision the future or even to know what to hope for when things seem hard or difficult. I get stuck on what was or what might have been. I can always see what I've lost. It's not always easy to see what's ahead. Yet somehow Joseph trusted that God was giving him a future. And so when this moment arrived, he was able to get a glimpse of it. And sometimes for us, simply being confident that God is actually promising us a future is what makes it possible for each one of us to live in new and surprising ways. And I think also for Joseph, and maybe this is the main thing, Joseph is able to stay focused on the mission that God had given him, instead of getting caught up in the family drama. Joseph's brothers were always worried about paybacks. That's what they were focused on. But Joseph says, in effect, you know what? We're only in year 2 of this famine. We got 5 more to go. Ain't nobody got time for this revenge nonsense. And part of that was surely realizing that there was no way to focus on getting revenge on his brothers without jeopardizing the rest of the family. His dad, his nephews, his nieces, all of those people depended upon him now. And if he decided he was going to off all of his brothers or make them all his slaves, all of those people would suffer too. And he sees that somehow God has given him a mission to keep those people alive. And he can either do that or he can get revenge. And he chooses God's mission in his life. And often, that focus is what's key for us too. And it can also be hard, because it's easy to be distracted both emotionally and mentally. But part of the key to being a surprise, to being God's surprise in the life of the world, is to ask ourselves each day, what is God calling me to do right now? How am I supposed to be making the most of what I've been given for others in my community? Because surely the answer to that is not getting my revenge. And the ability to stay focused on what God has given me to do, or even just the effort to try to stay focused on the good things that God has given me to do, even in the midst of terrible and difficult situations, that kind of thing is what can make me the kind of surprise that Jesus calls me to be in the life of the world around me. Joseph, he was a surprise in the life of his brothers and in the life of the world, and it may be that being a surprise is what made Joseph remembered, because he was a surprise that made God's light shine in a time of very deep darkness in the world around him. And this story is paired with our gospel reading today because he's an illustration of what Jesus is calling us to do as his disciples. Jesus is really calling us to be a surprise in the life of the world around us, because it's by being a surprise that we reveal God's light during dark times that people are going through. And it can be hard to be a surprise. But like Joseph, sometimes the key to being a surprise is to recognize how God has blessed us in spite of the evil and the pain that we or others may have experienced or be experiencing. Sometimes the key to being a surprise is to remind ourselves that God has promised us a better future, even when the future may not look like we used to envision it. And often, the key to being a surprise is not to dwell on the pain of the past or even the present, but to stay focused on whatever personal mission God is giving to each one of us each day.